Love stories rarely begin with murder. They begin with warmth, laughter, and that fragile hope that someone finally understands us. That is how Ethan Hale and Marissa Dorian began. Two young professionals living in the same apartment building in a quiet corner of the city, drawn together in the melted glow of late-night hallway conversations. Ethan was gentle but emotionally withdrawn, a man who carried loneliness like a second shadow. Marissa was vibrant to the point of fragility, the kind of woman whose heart felt too big for her body and too eager to be filled by someone who saw her the way she wanted to be seen. Their romance didn't spark like fireworks. It grew like a candle flame, steady, warm, and delicate enough to vanish with a single breath. They spent months wrapped in each other's worlds, sharing routines, small secrets, half-finished dreams. But there was one truth Marissa never shared, one name she kept buried beneath her forced smiles and soft kisses: Adrian Blackwell, her ex, a man she once loved deeply and feared even more deeply. Adrian wasn't just an old flame, he was a storm waiting for a spark. Their breakup had been chaotic, a whirlwind of screaming arguments and uncontrollable emotion. And while Marissa believed she had outrun his orbit, Adrian never truly stopped circling her. Ethan didn't know any of this, not yet. He simply saw Marissa as a woman recovering from heartbreak, searching for a gentle space to breathe. And for a time, he offered exactly that. But passion is a strange architect. It can build a home or burn it down. As their bond deepened, as trust wove itself quietly through their days, pieces of Marissa's past began drifting into the open in small, trembling ways. A late-night phone call she refused to answer, a message notification she hid from view, a tension in her voice that didn't match her words. The first real crack appeared one night as rain lashed softly against Ethan's windows. They sat together on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching a low-volume nature documentary to unwind after work. But Marissa kept glancing at her phone, her eyes clouded by something Ethan didn't understand. Eventually, after minutes of strained silence, he reached out and gently took her hand. "Marissa, what's wrong?" Her breath wavered, and for a moment Ethan thought she might lie. But she didn't, not entirely. "My ex has been calling again. It's nothing. He doesn't want to let go." Ethan nodded, trying to appear calm, but a knot tightened in his stomach. Jealousy flickered, not the violent, consuming kind, but the wounded kind that comes from feeling like a ghost in someone else's love story. He asked questions carefully, afraid of the answers. "Is he dangerous?" She didn't speak right away. That silence told him everything. Ethan didn't pressure her. He didn't demand she block Adrian or confront him. He simply held her and promised she was safe. But that night planted something inside him, a defensive fire he didn't yet understand, something primal and territorial. Love, when threatened, can twist into shapes people don't recognize. Ethan had never been jealous before. He didn't know the language of insecurity, didn't know that jealousy starts quietly, like a whisper behind the ribs, before it can turn into a voice loud enough to drown out reason. Over the next 2 weeks, little things piled up. A bouquet of wilted flowers left on Marissa's doorstep with no card, a car lingering too long outside the building, a shadowy figure spotted near the mailbox after midnight. Ethan began walking Marissa to her apartment door, insisting she text him when she reached work, checking on her throughout the day. She told him she appreciated it, but Ethan could feel her fear growing with every sunset. And then came the night everything changed. It was late, past midnight, and Ethan had fallen asleep on Marissa's couch after a quiet movie night. The glow from a street lamp filtered through the curtains in thin golden slices. The room was peaceful, still, safe, until the sharp metallic sound of Marissa's phone vibrating against the coffee table jolted Ethan awake. Marissa wasn't in the living room. She had stepped into the kitchen to get water, unaware that the call flashing across the screen was not hidden by her lock screen privacy settings. And Ethan, sleep blurred, heartbeat heavy in his chest, looked at the glowing name. Adrian, again. Something hot and raw unfurled inside him, a tension he'd never felt before. He didn't pick up the phone, didn't snoop through messages, didn't cross that line. But he stared at the name long enough to feel something inside him fracture. Marissa returned to the room and froze when she saw the screen too. The look in her eyes wasn't guilt, it was exhaustion, fear, something deeper than heartbreak. "Ethan, I'm sorry," she whispered, as if she had done something wrong simply by existing inside Adrian's unfinished obsession. Ethan stood, ran his hand through his hair, and let out a long, tortured breath. "Why is he still calling? Why is he still trying to reach you? I don't understand." She shook her head. "I told him it's over. I told him to leave me alone. But when Adrian wants something, he doesn't stop. He never stops. What does he want?" Her voice broke. "Me, or no one else." That was the night Ethan realized this wasn't a simple breakup nightmare. This was a fuse waiting for a spark. A love triangle twisted not by romance, but by possession and fear. Adrian wasn't calling out of longing, he was calling out of control. And Ethan, feeling the first true wave of helpless fury in his life, understood that this man, this shadow from Marissa's past, was not someone who would fade quietly. For the first time since meeting Marissa, Ethan felt something dangerous enter his bloodstream. He didn't know whether it was protectiveness, jealousy, or something darker. All he knew was that if Adrian crossed a certain line, Ethan would not stand by and watch the woman he cared for crumble under another man's obsession. Love had turned the first hinge. Jealousy would soon turn the second, and soon after that, a fatal decision would be made. But not yet, not tonight. Tonight, the storm only gathered. Tomorrow, it would break. The morning after the rainstorm, the city felt quieter than usual, a low, almost oppressive hum threading through the streets. Ethan woke on the couch, still wrapped in the blanket from the night before, and watched Marissa sleep across the room, her hair cascading over her shoulders like a shadowed river. The events of the previous night pressed on his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. He didn't want to admit it, didn't even want to name it, but the flicker of jealousy that had ignited in him was now a small, angry flame, hungry for fuel. A flame that Adrian's persistent intrusion was feeding with each unread message, each ignored call. He didn't speak to Marissa about it at first. Instead, he went through the motions of a normal morning, forcing a smile while preparing coffee, answering a few work emails, trying to ignore the persistent unease in his chest. But even as they ate breakfast, the tension was palpable. Marissa kept glancing at her phone, stiffening whenever it buzzed, each notification a reminder of the shadow that lingered between them. Ethan could feel the boundaries of reason bending. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from Adrian, and the thought of failing ignited a cold, unfamiliar fear. That afternoon, Marissa left for work while Ethan lingered by the window, watching the street below with a gaze sharpened by suspicion. A black sedan idled near the corner of the block. At first, he tried to convince himself it was nothing, but the same car had been parked there the previous evening. And then the impossible thought crept into his mind. Adrian was watching. Ethan's pulse quickened. Each passing second added weight to a realization he wasn't ready to confront. By early evening, the tension had reached a critical point. Marissa returned from work, exhausted, her face pale under the artificial light of the apartment. She tried to smile at Ethan, but he barely returned it, his eyes constantly scanning the street below, ears attuned to every distant sound. She noticed his mood immediately. "Ethan, what's wrong?" she asked softly. But before he could answer, the phone rang. The name flashed on the screen, and everything inside him snapped. Adrian. Ethan seized the phone before Marissa could react. His fingers gripped it like it was a weapon. The screen illuminated the room with harsh white light. He pressed ignore, silenced it, then placed it face down on the table. His hands shook. Marissa's eyes widened. "Ethan," she whispered, I can't do this." Ethan cut her off, his voice taut, brittle. "I can't sit here and watch him like this, like he owns part of you, like I don't exist." His chest heaved, the weight of love twisted with fear and jealousy. It was no longer just a protective instinct. It had become something raw, something dangerous. Marissa reached for him, but he pulled back instinctively. "Ethan, please calm down," she pleaded. "It's just a phone. He's not here." But Ethan didn't believe her. Not anymore. Not when the black sedan was still parked on the street and when every subtle clue of Adrian's presence loomed like a specter in the corners of the apartment. Something primal, almost animalistic, surged within him. He wanted control. He wanted Adrian gone, not just silenced digitally, but removed from their lives entirely. That night, Ethan stayed awake, pacing the apartment. Every sound outside made him flinch. The slam of a neighbor's door, footsteps in the hall, the distant roar of traffic. And then he heard it. A faint engine, followed by the distinct click of the black sedan door shutting. He pressed himself against the window, squinting into the darkness. Adrian, watching, waiting. Ethan's heart pounded. The rational part of him screamed to call the police, to leave the apartment, to do nothing. But the darker part, the part fueled by jealousy and fear, whispered a single horrifying possibility. What if he confronted Adrian first? What if he ended the threat himself? The thought burned through him like acid. Hours passed in this torment. When Adrian finally left, Ethan collapsed in a chair, trembling, exhausted, consumed by thoughts he never thought he could entertain. The love he felt for Marissa had twisted into something lethal, a force he neither wanted nor could resist. He told himself repeatedly that he would never hurt anyone, but the seed had been planted, and some seeds grow in the shadows, unnoticed until they bloom into violent reality. The following day, Adrian's presence became more tangible. A neighbor mentioned seeing him outside the building again, lingering near the mailbox, observing Marissa as if she were a fragile object to be reclaimed. Ethan's patience snapped. He followed Adrian that evening, driving slowly behind him through wet, empty streets. The city was slick with rain, neon lights reflecting in puddles, giving everything a surreal, dreamlike quality. Adrian stopped at a quiet park, stood under a flickering street lamp, checking his phone. Ethan's mind raced, calculating every possibility. By the time Ethan returned to the apartment, Marissa was frantic. She sensed the storm in his eyes before he even spoke. "Ethan, what did you do?" she asked. But Ethan said nothing. The silence was heavy with unspoken intent, a promise and a threat wrapped in the same shadow. The triangle had tightened. Love, jealousy, and obsession now moved together, a dangerous choreography waiting for the next misstep. That night, Ethan could not sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining scenarios he wished he could erase from his mind. The thought of Adrian touching Marissa, of her fear, of the violation of trust, made his pulse spike and his hands clench. And in that quiet, obsessive solitude, he began planning, not rationally, not consciously yet, but instinctively. Love had become a weapon, jealousy had become ammunition, and tomorrow would be the day the fuse met the spark. Outside, the city hummed, oblivious to the storm brewing within the walls of an ordinary apartment. A black sedan idled somewhere in the distance, its engine whispering promises that only Ethan could hear. The night seemed to stretch infinitely, holding its breath as if the world knew the next moments would decide the trajectory of 3 lives intertwined in passion, obsession, and danger. And somewhere, in the shadows of desire and fear, The first fatal decision waited, silent, patient, and inevitable. The night air was thick, humid, and heavy with tension, pressing against Ethan's chest as he stepped into the deserted park where he had tracked Adrian earlier. Streetlights cast sickly yellow halos through the mist, illuminating the glistening asphalt and the slick patches of fallen leaves. Every sound, footsteps on concrete, the rustle of wind through trees, the distant hum of traffic, made him flinch. His hand hovered near his pocket, restless, clutching a small, cold object he had never imagined he would carry. The obsession that had been simmering for weeks had now reached a boiling point, and rational thought was nothing more than a faint echo, drowned out by the roaring pulse of jealousy. He didn't have to wait long. Adrian emerged from the shadows near the park bench as if summoned by some invisible thread, carrying his phone and a leather messenger bag slung casually over one shoulder. He looked calm, unbothered, unaware that Ethan had been shadowing his every step. Adrian's eyes scanned the park, his expression unreadable, but Ethan, standing in the darkness, saw every twitch of his jaw, every small flicker of arrogance. It was a look he hated, a look that belonged to a man who thought he could possess what Ethan now considered his, possess Marissa. And in that instant, something inside Ethan snapped completely. He approached silently, footsteps muffled by the wet grass, heart pounding so violently it seemed to shake his whole body. The rational part of him screamed to stop, to leave the confrontation for daylight, to call the police and let the law decide. But the primal part, the one driven by the gnawing mixture of love, fear, and jealousy, spurred him forward. Every step drew him closer to the inevitable, a collision of obsession and desperation. Adrian noticed him at the last second, eyes widening ever so slightly, but it was too late. Ethan was there, close enough to see the faint tremor in Adrian's hand as he instinctively reached for the phone. Words were unnecessary. In that shared gaze, both men understood what had been building for weeks. This was no longer a game of subtle threats or digital stalking. This was a confrontation where only one could walk away. Ethan's voice was low, restrained, but every syllable carried the weight of weeks of tension. "Stay away from her," he said, and in the sound of it, there was no room for argument, no pause for negotiation. Adrian laughed softly, almost mockingly, the sound slicing through the humid night like a knife. "Or what?" he asked. "You think you can stop me?" The moment stretched. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat pounding in Ethan's ears like a drum signaling an impending battle. Then Adrian moved first, stepping back, phone raised slightly as though to make a call, to alert someone, to escape. But Ethan reacted faster, fueled by a mixture of fear and love twisted into a sharp edge. He lunged, grabbing Adrian's arm, and the two men collided in a tangle of limbs and desperation. Adrian struggled, cursed, tried to twist free, but Ethan's resolve had hardened into a physical force as well as an emotional one. They fell near the park bench, the wet leaves crunching beneath them. Adrian's messenger bag spilled open, scattering papers and a small notebook across the grass. Ethan's grip never faltered, hands shaking with adrenaline, eyes locked on the man who had haunted every shadow of his life for weeks. In the struggle, a sharp sound rang out, metal striking concrete. Ethan barely registered it, but Adrian did, stumbling back with a cry of surprise and pain. Silence fell immediately after. Both men froze, breaths ragged, hearts hammering like twin war drums. Adrian lay on the wet ground, clutching a scraped forearm, staring at Ethan with something that resembled fear but also disbelief. Ethan stood over him, chest heaving, eyes dark with a mixture of triumph, terror, and the strange, sickening satisfaction of having exerted control over a threat that had consumed his mind. "I told you," Ethan said, voice trembling slightly, though stronger than he expected. "Stay away from her." He didn't strike again. He didn't need to. The power had shifted, and Adrian could feel it, raw and undeniable. The predator had been momentarily unmasked, and Ethan had become something he never thought possible. A man pushed beyond reason, beyond morality, into the territory where love and obsession are indistinguishable. Adrian scrambled to his feet, wiping blood from his forearm, anger and humiliation flashing across his face. "This isn't over," he spat. "You think you can protect her? You think this ends tonight?" Ethan didn't answer. The words were meaningless now. He had stared into the abyss and felt it stare back, and the abyss had blinked first. Marissa's voice broke the tension like glass. She had arrived silently, summoned by instinct or by a hunch, and now stood at the edge of the park, her eyes wide, hands trembling. "Ethan, stop!" she cried, her voice carrying over the damp grass. "Please, both of you, stop this!" Ethan's gaze shifted to her, and for the first time since the obsession had overtaken him, he felt the weight of his actions. He was standing over a man, bloodied, cursing, yet alive. He was alive. The reality of what he'd just done, the line he'd crossed, the edge he'd skirted, hit him in a wave of dizzying clarity. His hands trembled, his knees weakened, and he sank slowly onto the grass beside Adrian, unable to fully release the adrenaline that had carried him here. Adrian, now cautiously steadying himself, looked at Ethan with a mix of rage and something more complicated, recognition. He had underestimated Ethan, the quiet man who had once seemed fragile and harmless, and now in the dark park, wet leaves sticking to bloodied shoes, Adrian understood that the love Marissa had shown Ethan had forged a weapon in human form. Marissa ran to Ethan, taking his hand, holding him as if her touch could undo the tension of weeks, the near violence, the raw collision of desire and jealousy. "It's over," she whispered, though all three of them knew it was only partially true. Nothing was ever truly over. Passion leaves scars, and scars leave memories, and memories can drive ordinary people to extraordinary, sometimes deadly actions. Ethan looked down at the man before him, then at Marissa, and finally up at the dim streetlights, each flicker like a pulse in the dark night. He realized something terrifying yet liberating. Love can drive people to madness. Jealousy can ignite storms that no one intends to weather. And one fatal decision, just one, can alter the course of every life entangled within its reach. The night didn't end in police sirens or hospital lights. It ended in silence, the quiet after a storm, with three people standing in a dark park, soaked by rain, hearts still racing, and futures forever altered by a single night where passion and obsession had collided. And somewhere, deep in Ethan's chest, he knew that this was only the beginning. Love and jealousy were unpredictable forces, and as the black sedan disappeared into the distance once again, he understood that tomorrow demanded new decisions, perhaps darker, perhaps deadlier. Because in crimes of passion, there is always another spark waiting. The morning after the park confrontation arrived with a heavy, oppressive gray light that pressed through the blinds, painting Ethan's apartment in shades of guilt and exhaustion. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't fully spoken since the events of the previous night. Marissa sat on the edge of the couch, staring blankly at her hands, her face pale and strained. The reality of what had transpired hovered over them like a storm cloud that refused to break, and for the first time, Ethan realized that passion was a double-edged blade. It protected, but it also destroyed. Ethan could feel the remnants of adrenaline still thrumming in his veins, sharp and insistent, like a heartbeat that refused to slow. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Adrian's face, the smirk, the arrogance, the disbelief that Ethan had risen to meet him. And alongside that, he saw Marissa, terrified yet compassionate, caught between two men whose emotions had grown too dangerous to contain. The truth hit him with a sudden clarity. This wasn't merely a matter of jealousy or fear. This was about consequences. Every action, every choice made in the heat of passion left marks that would not fade. Marissa spoke first, her voice soft, almost fragile. "Ethan, what are we going to do?" She didn't need to elaborate, the question was understood. Adrian was alive, yes, but he would not forget, and more importantly, neither would the authorities. Violence, once unleashed, has a way of tracking its own path. Ethan swallowed hard, realizing that their lives had shifted irreversibly. The comfortable rhythm of their apartment, the quiet sanctuary of their shared routine, had been replaced by tension, fear, and a fragile understanding of mortality. Ethan paced the apartment, each step a battle with the images lodged in his mind. He thought of the small cuts on Adrian's arm, the scattered papers, the blood on the wet leaves in the park. He thought of the physical exertion of confronting a man whose presence had loomed over every corner of his life. And beneath all of that, he felt the undercurrent of something darker, a seductive intoxication of power. For the first time, he understood that jealousy could fuel not just protection, but domination, the control of a situation, the manipulation of fear, the quiet satisfaction of having survived where another might have fallen. But even as these thoughts pulsed within him, the rational mind forced its way through. Ethan knew the danger that lingered. Adrian was unpredictable, impulsive, and now personally humiliated. There was no telling what lengths he might go to in order to regain control, to assert dominance over Marissa, to reclaim what he believed was his. The triangle had not been resolved. It had only shifted, the points realigning, tension coiling tighter with every hour that passed. Hours later, a knock on the door broke the silence. Ethan's heart leapt, but it was Marissa, returning from an errand. She carried a bag of groceries, her expression cautiously neutral, as if attempting to anchor normalcy back into the apartment. But even in the mundane rhythm of unpacking vegetables and stacking cans, the tension was palpable. Every glance toward the street, every pause at the sound of a car, reminded them that the park confrontation had altered their lives forever. By evening, Adrian had begun to make his presence felt again. The black sedan returned, parked at a distance, headlights flickering in the mist like watchful eyes. Ethan noticed it immediately from the apartment window, and the old raw surge of jealousy, fear, and protective instinct flared. He clenched his fists, feeling that all too familiar hunger of a man who had crossed the line once and knew he might have to do so again. Marissa sensed it too, pressing her hand against his arm, trying to tether him to caution, to reason, to the fragile thread of safety that remained. But reason had become a fragile whisper beneath the roar of obsession. Ethan couldn't ignore the car, the shadow of Adrian's watchful eyes, or the gnawing certainty that in a matter of time, Adrian would attempt to assert control again. Love had shifted into something unrecognizable, a weapon in Ethan's hands, a liability in his mind, a storm waiting to strike. The psychological weight was nearly unbearable. He realized that passion, when fused with jealousy, was not merely an emotion, it was a force that could dictate behavior, warp perception, and, if unchecked, destroy lives. The night deepened, and with it the tension. Rain returned, soft and insistent, tapping against the window like the ticking of a clock counting down to inevitable conflict. Marissa attempted to soothe him, wrapping herself in his arms, whispering reassurances that seemed to dissolve under the weight of fear. Ethan held her, feeling the paradox of warmth and anxiety intertwine. He loved her fiercely, undeniably, and yet the intensity of that love had birthed a dangerous, uncontrollable side of himself he had never confronted before. Suddenly a sound, a loud, deliberate knock echoed through the apartment, breaking the fragile calm. Ethan froze. Marissa clutched his arm, eyes wide with terror. Another knock, harder, more insistent. The black sedan was gone, but the message was unmistakable. Adrian was close, watching, waiting. And in that instant, Ethan understood the truth he had been avoiding. Love, jealousy, and fatal decisions form a chain, and once one link snaps, the consequences ripple outward, touching every life nearby. Without a word, Ethan moved to the door, his body tense, muscles coiled for confrontation. Marissa followed silently, hand in his, her eyes wide with fear and concern. He peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, yet the sense of threat lingered like smoke in a closed room. Then a note slipped under the door. Ethan retrieved it, unfolding the paper with hands that trembled despite his attempt at composure. Written in neat, deliberate handwriting were two chilling words: "This isn't over." Marissa gasped. Ethan's chest tightened. The message was clear. Adrian had not forgotten, had not forgiven, and had no intention of yielding. The triangle was still active, still dangerous, and now, with physical evidence of Adrian's obsession laid bare, Ethan realized that the park confrontation had escalated their situation beyond control. What had begun as protective love had now transformed into a psychological battlefield where every emotion, fear, desire, jealousy, could dictate the next fatal move. By the end of the night, Ethan and Marissa sat together, side by side on the couch, silent except for the rain tapping on the windows. Both understood that the events of the past days were a turning point. Love had collided with jealousy, passion had collided with fear, and soon a final decision would be demanded, one that could not be reversed. The tension in the apartment was suffocating, thick as the fog outside, and both of them knew that tomorrow would bring choices they might not survive, choices that could transform obsession into tragedy and passion into permanent loss. The night stretched into hours of quiet contemplation. Ethan stared at the ceiling, imagining scenarios, rehearsing reactions, tracing every potential movement Adrian might make. Marissa lay beside him, eyes open, thoughts racing, but afraid to speak them aloud. The room was dark, the only light the faint red glow from a distant street lamp, casting shadows that seemed to move like living threats across the walls. The city outside continued its indifferent hum, oblivious to the storm brewing in a small apartment, where love and jealousy had collided, leaving a trail of unease, fear, and the looming specter of fatal decisions yet to come. And in that quiet, oppressive darkness, one truth became painfully clear. When passion mixes with jealousy, when love becomes entangled with fear, there are no simple outcomes. The triangle had tightened, the stakes had risen, and when humans are pushed to the edge by emotion, when the heart decides faster than the mind, fatal decisions are not just possible, they are inevitable. The night of the final confrontation did not arrive suddenly. It grew slowly, like a storm forming miles offshore, gathering strength in silence before unleashing itself upon the shoreline. Ethan felt it long before it came. The message, "This isn't over," had burrowed into him like a parasite, feeding on every ounce of fear, every drop of rage, every unspoken insecurity that had been festering since Adrian re-entered their lives. Passion had driven him once, jealousy had twisted his judgment, but now something else was settling inside him, something weighty and inevitable, the realization that the triangle could not remain unbroken. One side had to snap, one person had to fall. For 2 days after the note appeared, Adrian's presence became an invisible noose tightening around their world. The black sedan returned each night, sometimes parked across the street, sometimes idling at the corner, always watching. Ethan and Marissa could not step onto their balcony without scanning the shadows, could not leave the apartment without the sense that someone trailed too closely, stared too long, lingered too silently. The tension was suffocating. They slept in fractured shifts, waking at the slightest tap of rain against the glass or the muffled sound of footsteps in the hallway. On the third night, something changed. The car disappeared. The street remained empty, desolate, too quiet, too still. And in that unnatural silence, Ethan felt the air itself constrict, as if the world were holding its breath. Adrian was no longer watching. He was preparing. Ethan sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside his hand. Marissa hovered near the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, her eyes wide with a fear she no longer tried to hide. "Ethan, please," she whispered, "whatever you're thinking, don't. This isn't you." But she was wrong, because this was him, or at least this was the version of himself that had been forged in the past weeks, a man pushed to the brink by obsession, love, and the primal urge to protect what he cherished. The Ethan she knew was gentle, thoughtful, patient, but that Ethan had been eroded by stress, suspicion, sleepless nights, and the constant, corrosive presence of Adrian. Love had not saved him from darkness, it had led him toward it. "I'm not going to let him hurt us," Ethan murmured, his voice low, steady. "He knows where we live. He comes and goes whenever he wants. He's escalating, and if I don't stop him, he will push until something breaks." Marissa approached him, touching his shoulder with trembling fingers. "Then we go to the police," she pleaded. "We tell them everything." But Ethan knew the truth. They had no concrete proof, no violence caught on camera, no explicit threats, no assault that could be tied unmistakably to Adrian. A few confrontations, a slip of paper, a car that could not be traced. Adrian was deliberate, methodical. He left no evidence behind. And passion, Ethan realized, was the most dangerous when it demanded immediate action. The breaking point came at 2:37 a.m. A sound, a deliberate, calculated scrape against the apartment door. Ethan and Marissa froze. Another scrape, slower this time, like someone dragging an object across the wood. Ethan stood, heart pounding with a force that felt almost violent. He stepped toward the door, every muscle tense, every nerve sparking with electric fear. Marissa's whisper was a frantic plea behind him. "Ethan, don't! Please, don't open it!" He ignored her. Peering through the peephole, he saw nothing, only the dim hallway, walls painted in shadow. But the sound had been unmistakable. Someone had been there. Someone had tested the lock. Someone wanted them to know. And that was when Ethan made the fatal decision. He grabbed his coat. Marissa grabbed his wrist. Their eyes met in the dim red glow filtering through the blinds, her eyes filled with terror, his with a quiet, burning resolve. "I have to end this," he said, voice trembling, not with fear, but conviction. Marissa shook her head, tears forming. Ending it doesn't mean surviving it. But Ethan had stopped listening. Love, once pure, had become a burden too heavy to carry. Jealousy, once rooted in insecurity, had grown into obsession. And now, with danger pressing against their door, passion had transformed fully into something sharp, dangerous, and irreversible. He left the apartment. The hallway was suffocatingly quiet. Each step felt amplified, echoing in the silence like the slow toll of a funeral bell. Ethan descended the stairs, his breath fogging in the cool air, the world around him coated in a thin layer of mist and shadow. Outside, the street lay empty. Street lamps flickered in the haze. The city felt abandoned, asleep, unaware of the moment that was about to unfold. Ethan scanned the darkness, waiting for movement, for a shape to emerge, for the black sedan to reappear. And then he saw him. Adrian stepped out from the shadow of an alleyway, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Not smug, not angry, simply calm, controlled, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. "So," Adrian said softly, "you finally came out." Ethan approached slowly, each step deliberate, driven by a mixture of rage and fear. "You need to leave us alone," he said, voice steady but trembling beneath the surface. "This ends now." Adrian tilted his head slightly, as though studying an animal caught in a trap of its own making. "You know, This would have been so much simpler if you had just stayed out of it. Ethan clenched his fists. She doesn't want you. She's afraid of you. Adrian's smile was a cold, bitter thing. Fear and love aren't opposites, Ethan. They're neighbors. Sometimes you can't tell one from the other. Ethan's chest tightened. He felt heat rise inside him, boiling past reason. If you come near her again, I swear. Before he could finish, Adrian stepped closer. You'll do what? Hit me? Kill me? His voice was quiet, almost amused, because if you do, you'd better be ready to explain to her how passion turned you into everything you claimed to hate. The words struck Ethan like a physical blow. Adrian was taunting him, but beneath the taunts lay a truth Ethan didn't want to face. Passion had transformed him. Love had driven him to anger. Jealousy had poisoned him. And now he stood in a dark street prepared to do something he could never undo. But fate, not intention, delivered the final blow. A door slammed somewhere behind them, startling both men. Adrian turned his head sharply. Ethan flinched. A momentary misstep, a shift in balance, and suddenly Adrian slipped backwards on the slick pavement. His foot twisted, his hands reached out blindly. He fell, head striking the curb with a sickening crack that reverberated through the empty street. Silence followed, a deep, consuming silence. Ethan's breath stopped. His body felt weightless, hollow. He stepped forward, trembling, kneeling beside Adrian, but one look told everything. Adrian's eyes were open, frozen in shock. His chest did not rise. His pulse did not move. It was over. Not by Ethan's hand, not directly, but because he had shown up, because he had fed the passion, because he had taken the fatal step into the night. Marissa ran outside seconds later, having witnessed everything from the balcony. She collapsed beside Ethan, her sobs muffled by rain and trembling hands. Ethan stared at the body, unable to speak, unable to breathe. The weight of the moment pressed on him like a crushing force, suffocating and dense. The police would come, questions would follow, explanations would blur, but none of it would change the truth. Adrian had died in a moment fueled by passion, born from jealousy, fed by obsession, and ended by an unavoidable collision of fear and fate. In the end, crimes of passion are not always deliberate. Sometimes they are the inevitable result of loving too fiercely, fearing too deeply, and letting emotion guide the hand before reason can interfere. The rain fell harder, erasing footprints, washing away blood, blurring the lines of guilt and innocence. But the consequences, the emotional scars left behind, would remain etched in Ethan and Marissa forever. And just like that, the triangle collapsed, not with a scream, but with a silent, irrevocable fall.